So, shitty news. MSNBC is pulling the plug on its weekend morning news show, Melissa Harris Perry. A huge setback for diversity on cable news. Aside from being the only woman of color hosting an editorial cable news program, Melissa Harris Perry consistently had the most diverse set of guests of any Sunday morning news show, by a pretty wide margin. Without her, Sunday mornings on cable news are basically a white man's game. But cable news is just part of a much broader media diversity problem. The number of people of color in print and radio newsrooms has been basically stagnant for the past 20 years. But who cares, right? News is news. Or as Melissa Harris Perry once put it,
what difference does it make if a black man or a white woman is calling the shots at the New York Times, or at your local radio station, or in your favorite cable news show?
Why does it matter if the stories we hear and read in the media are primarily being told by white people?
Does institutional racism exist anymore? No, it does not.
It's easy to think about diversity as a newsroom problem.
Diversity has become one of those buzzwords that's fairly meaningless. I think we tend to think of it as something that's feel good or something that's nice to have, and not as something that's necessary and that's imperative.
But it's more than that. It's an accuracy problem.
We're often not thinking about it that way because white is normative. And so there's a sense that white journalists are neutral and that they are able to see everything in a neutral, unbiased way. But of course, that's not true. White journalists are human beings. When you're a white journalist and you grew up in a community where your interactions with police are respectful, where your schools aren't segregated and you have quality teachers, that is definitely going to bleed into how you're covering schools. It's going to bleed into how you're covering law enforcement.
This doesn't mean that white journalists and commentators can't do good work.
There's no journalist who doesn't have a blind spot. There are not any human beings who don't have blind spots. It's not that these errors are intentional.
But they view and understand the world in a specific way, based on their own experiences, backgrounds, and biases. The absence of people of color on TV and in newsrooms means that a lot of bullshit slips by undetected, like when Fox News convenes all-white panels to talk about race in America.
Liberalism has a kind of Tourette syndrome these days. It just constantly saying the word racism and racist.
There's white on black racism, black on white racism, but it is not the majority of Americans by any stretch.
And it's not just the ridiculous Fox panels. Think about the coverage of Baltimore or Ferguson. White journalists, who likely haven't experienced racist police treatment or the effects of institutionalized racism, often ended up focusing on the reactions of protesters instead of focusing on the long-term inequalities that led to the protests in the first place.
How does that justify what they did? I mean, that's a sense of right from wrong. They know it's wrong to steal and burn down a CVS and an old person's home. I mean, come on.
Not having that diversity just means one side of the story tends to get told, and that there isn't pushback, there aren't conversations being had about coverage to say, is this really fair?
Having people of color on TV and in the newsroom creates a natural check against bullshit.
Who are you to tell us we're not having that experience when you're not living it? You're not in our bodies. It's insulting for you to say, oh, that's not happening. How can you say that?
What's important is to say, I know I'm coming from this perspective. How do I mitigate that with my reporting to make sure that it's fair? And one way of doing that, of course, is having diverse colleagues.
News media is a huge part of the way that we tell stories about ourselves and the world around us. If we want those stories to be fair, accurate, and smart, the newsrooms behind them have to reflect the communities they're reporting on. We need to stop thinking about diversity in the media as a luxury good. White newsrooms are broken newsrooms.